All right, hello there, everybody. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and welcome to today's Committee for Sydney Live, featuring Councillor Jess Scully, Deputy Lord Mayor of Sydney and author of Glimpses of Utopia, Real Ideas for a Fairer World. To start, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. While we are meeting online today, and you may be in another part of Sydney or the world, I am currently on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people. So this book, Glimpses of Utopia, has been described by one commentator as providing a very rare thing these days, and that is hope. Against all kinds of challenges, both here in Australia and all over the world, it put forward practical solutions, real world solutions based on creativity, resilience, and compassion. Today, Jess will focus especially on the parts of the book that relate to cities, but you'll hear an overview, I assume, as well. So as Committee for Sydney members well know, Jess Scully is a politician, a public art curator, a festival director, and a media producer who uses creativity and the arts to engage communities. Since 2019, she has been Deputy Lord Mayor for the City of Sydney. In addition to many other things, she was founding director of Vivid Ideas, Australia's largest creative industries event. She has curated creative sector events, including Junket, TEDx Sydney, and curating participation. Glimpses of Utopia is her first book. We are very excited. She's joining us to talk about it. We can't believe she actually found the time and energy to write a book. It's incredible, in addition to everything else she did. The way this works, Jess will make some remarks, we'll be in conversation, and then I will start to bring in questions, which you can submit via the Q&A app on Zoom. So with that, Jess, thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Thanks, Gabriel. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal land and to pay my respects to elders past and present and the next generation of elders of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded over this place. I'm so thrilled to be here in the company of city makers and people who are passionate about policy, about making changes in place that are going to help include more people, bring forth more voices, make our cities engines of inclusion, sustainability, creativity, and production. And I see enormous potential in our cities, and most of all, I see huge potential in Sydney. I love Sydney, and I think Sydney represents a place where we have the potential to be the incubator of what a city can do for the 21st century. We can test ideas, we can show what's possible, and we can model the future that we want to live in. And that's why I'm involved in helping to shape Sydney, but it's also one of the reasons why I wrote this book. And let me show you a little bit about the book. There's a lot in there, but I'm going to take you through some of it. Hang on, I think I've just got to share my screen with you. Here we go. So the idea, oops, sorry about this, guys. There we go. So the idea that really kicked off Glimpses for me was, you know, an experience of working with a group of young students in southwestern Sydney who didn't see a place for themselves in the future. They couldn't see how their voices would be heard, or they didn't see a vision of the future that they could be excited about. And I feel like I have this incredibly privileged experience of encountering people who make change and who offer alternatives all the time. And I wanted to be able to share some of that experience with a broader group of people. And so once I started, and I suppose that also comes from the place, and that's what this line from the book tries to sum up is that we have this vision of the future as being this other place, this perfectly realised utopia or dystopia that is quite distinct from the world that we're in today. But actually, I think there are little glimpses of this potential future that are latent in the world that we have today and in the choices that are shaped by the choices we make today. And I want to be able to highlight those so that we can pick them out from around the world, stitch them together, and come up with new pathways towards that more inclusive, more sustainable future. And the issues that I came to the book wanting to address at the core of the book are the great challenges of inequality and climate change and climate destruction and disruption. So I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think they're both symptoms of a system that has misaligned incentives and it's generating antisocial outcomes from a human as well as an economic and environmental perspective. So that's why there's so much in this book. So these are my chapter headings. And I suppose what happened was I started to tell part of the story and I realized I had to tell more and more and more of this story. So really I look at this idea of what are these visions of the future? What are utopias? How do we reframe our priorities to recenter the citizen? What are some different ways we can measure success for society? How do we refocus politics? And this is something I want to dive in a little bit more into today, because I think politics is still the best tool that we have for social decision making, but it's not working in the way that we do it right now. How do we address work? How do we address the way that work has disconnected from jobs and what the outcomes are for people from that and whether there are alternatives? How do we reward the caring instinct that we have to care for people, planet and place? And how do we change those perverse incentives that I mentioned earlier to recoup the investments that we make as a polity, as a community into business, whether that's through tax or through ownership of those businesses that we invest in? How do we look at the role of finance and elevate a more ethical role for finance? How do we look at the commons differently? And I, in particular, focused on the digital commons, so the internet and how we look at data and its ownership and its use. Then Rebuild for Equity is really the chapter that's about city making, and then a conversation about media and the public sphere and how we even have conversations about these kinds of big picture topics. So as you can tell, there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm going to whiz through some key ideas. So recenter the citizen. One of the examples that I explore is the wellbeing budget from New Zealand. And this was something that I'm sure many of you have heard about, came out in mid-2019, basically putting some different KPIs into the New Zealand budget, improving child wellbeing, mental health, having different metrics in place, whether it's around soil erosion and water quality, or how many people live in a home, some of the physical or the quantifiable metrics around child welfare. And the result has been a more collaborative approach to policy making, so that when ministers put in budget bids, they have to work across different departments and silos. I also reference the City of Sydney's wellbeing, community wellbeing indicators as a way of looking at, well, what is possible and how do we put human flourishing as the core metric that we're measuring, not just economic production and not just the very narrow approach that we've had focusing on GDP. Refocused politics is something that I'm really passionate about, and there's one example, and I should note that I was very conscious in writing this book to go beyond the Anglosphere in drawing out case studies. And I'm really proud to say that in Refocused Politics, I've got case studies from Taiwan, Iceland, Belgium, from Australia, as well as from Argentina and Syria. There are different approaches that we can learn from all over the world, not just the usual US and UK models that we tend to focus on. But I am going to talk about a Sydney project for this purpose. And this is about the citizens' jury that the City of Sydney ran in late 2019. It was run by the New Democracy Foundation, and I've got a quote here from Luca Belgiano-Nettis from the New Democracy Foundation. Really, the purpose of the City of Sydney's citizens' jury was to take on board the 2,500 suggestions and ideas we received from the people of Sydney when we asked them, what do you want Sydney to be in 2050? And this group of 50 Sydney-siders sat with that. They called experts. They spent weeks and months developing their own concepts and their own priorities for the city. And I was so moved to see that the holistic vision that they came back with was much more ambitious and much more courageous than we would normally see through the regular process of community consultation, or that we even see in political debate. These community members they've exhorted us to go beyond being a sustainable city, and they want us to be a regenerative city, a city that cleans the air and the water, that gives back more than it takes. And they have also exhorted us to go through a process of truth-telling when it comes to First Nations as the place of first contact. They've asked us to put culture and nightlife at the heart of any vision for the city. And it was incredibly reassuring. I think it gives politicians social license to go further and be braver. And I think this level of community involvement that's not consultation but active citizenship, active participation, is a conditioned precedent to anything more ambitious happening in our political life. We've absolutely got to empower and broaden the range of actors that we have contributing to policy making. And so some of the examples that I explored from other parts of the world were about, participatory budgeting, something that emerged from Brazil, that Iceland are doing very, very well, to Taiwan's much more intensive and ongoing policy innovation process and stakeholder collaboration process, v Taiwan, which is absolutely worth looking into for policymakers, to something that is much more ambitious from Syria, the Democratic Confederacy approach, which is really a bottom-up, society-led form of decision making, one that has emerged in one of the most complex contexts in the world, in the north and east of Syria. This is, as you can probably tell, one of my favourite chapters in the book, and something that I think we need to expand, not just who represents us, and we need to have a more representative elected class, I suppose, or elected representative group in our community. But we also need to change the way we engage with citizens and offer them more entry points into meaningful decision making, not just during elections, but between elections. And now I'm going to jump forward because I know you're all city makers and you want to talk about place, and so do I. And this is a chapter called Rebuild for Equity. And there's so much in this chapter. I touch on social infrastructure and building cultural and social places for people to come together, and the function that provides in a community, and great examples from China, from the US, the UK, from other places that we can draw from. There's a lot in there about enumeration and mapping, particularly of informal settlements in places like Bangladesh and in Kenya. And I also look at, but when I kind of, one other thing I'll mention very quickly, I also look at building codes and housing efficiency and the challenges that we have in Australia with something that Professor Matt Santamoris, an energy physicist that I interviewed in this part of the book, he tells me that we have the most expensive and most poorly built housing in the world. And he says in all of the work that he has done on energy poverty in the world, the only country he's ever found that fails to measure energy poverty is Australia. So I'm very glad that Matt is now working in Sydney, and he is a really fascinating contributor to this discussion, and something that I hope that the Community for Sydney can have further conversations about. But the topic within this chapter that I'd like to focus on for you today is around land, because when it gets down to it, land is it's the basis for so many, and the way that we deal with land is the basis for so many of the shortcomings that we face, and the inequities we face around land use. So, you know, starting out with this Georgist idea of everybody works but the vacant lot. I don't need to tell anybody who's in Sydney listening into this conversation that the price of land goes up and up, the price of dwellings go up and up, completely out of step with the way that wages haven't increased, or the way that the cost of living has been moving. You know, there are, of course, we know this. We know that it takes an inordinate amount of time for people to save up to buy a home, and it takes up far too much of your income to rent a home. As many of you would know, the standard for housing stress is spending more than 30% of your income on housing in a rental, or in whether you own it. And of course, in Sydney, we're paying on average 32% of our income on housing. So we know housing, and we know land, the cost of land is a challenge. What I ask us to do through the book is to question the assumptions we have about land, to actually look at what is lost in the business as usual approach, who's missing out, what uses get priced out, whose needs aren't being addressed, and where is that land value going? Is it being retained from, and is it contributing back to local communities in any meaningful way? I tell you, it's not coming back in rates. So that's a whole other conversation, but that is something we need to talk about. So what I'm suggesting through the book, because in the book I am identifying and naming and describing the challenges, but also really focused on solutions. We can use land without paying for the relentless increase in land value, or we can also use the increase in land value to pay for more pro-social uses, to actually fund the kinds of uses and communities that the market has left behind. Now, this is a big chunk of a quote. I apologise for that. But this is from the excellent Associate Professor Louise Crabtree. She's an expert in permanent affordability at the University of Western Sydney. And Louise says, you know, when land is a commodity, we don't get innovation. We get stockpiling, and we get speculation. And the market logic isn't translating into innovation. All we're getting is profit seeking, literal rent seeking. So how can we reframe that? And I'm very pleased to say Louise was one of the finalists in the city's Alternative Housing Ideas competition, something that I was very proud to champion at the city last year. And it's I'd love to talk about it more in our conversation as well. But Louise was part of a team that brought the idea of community land trusts and holding land in perpetuity for permanent affordability, taking land out of the market and allowing the uses that need to take place on it to function without having to deal with the relentless increase in land value, which, you know, prices either affordable housing, food uses, community uses, public space. It prices all of those things, and even workspace all get priced out, as I probably don't need to tell many of you. And Louise is an expert in community land trusts, and I'm very excited about community land trusts. That image there on the left comes from a New York community group that focuses on community land trusts. And interestingly, they are much more common in the US and in Europe. and they actually originate from quite an ancient Indian concept around the idea of communal land, around villages that are used for common good, sort of commons that are managed by communities in Indian villages. And that's something that was then transposed from India to initially to the US, and then has really taken hold in places like Switzerland and Germany as well. So the thing about community land trusts is that they are anti-speculative, they're non-extractive, they're about having local decision-making and democratic governance by community groups or by boards of the use of that land. And the idea is to manage that land as a resource for public benefit, and to do so in perpetuity. So I'm really hopeful. They're very rare in Australia, and we don't really have functioning models for them or the legal infrastructure that's required. So I'm really hopeful that arising from the work that's being done as part of that Alternative Housing Ideas Challenge at the City of Sydney, that I'm hopeful we will develop further models so that this can become a more common and more viable means of taking land out of the market in Sydney and in Australia. But here's another idea. So this is an idea, look, I'm just going to give you a minute with it. Another big quote. So this is a bit of a radical idea, but the idea here, and this comes from Indy Johar, I'll tell you about him in a minute, but the idea here is that it's not my house, it's not my bit of land, it's everything else around it. It's the access to transport, to jobs, to schools. It's the great cafe on the corner. It's the artists and creatives making the place interesting, putting on the live music events down the road. Those are the factors that are increasing the value of that house, the value of that land. And yet the benefit is extracted to a very few who may not be contributing that value back into the local community. And Indy Johar, who explained this concept to me, is from a group called Dark Matter Labs. He's based in Birmingham, but they're a UK and European think tank, and they do some really interesting work questioning what he calls deep code, or some of the key assumptions that we make around the way that we live and how we share resources. So Indy worked with his collaborators on this project for Nesta in the UK. It was a project called the Network of City Endowments in late 2019. And what Indy said was, we see governments wanting to invest in startup incubators, and that's, a positive and useful move to provide space and resources for innovative businesses and new businesses to begin and thrive. But if we think about the city itself is an incubator of talent. It provides the space, the connections, the access to resources, the inspiration, the fuel, all of those, the networks that are necessary for businesses to thrive. They are also embodied in the city. So what if we created a way of seeing the city as a startup incubator, and created a series of endowments, extracting some of the uplift value that's derived from development, people taking advantage of those public goods that increase land value, and extracted that back in order to fund the city as a startup incubator or as a carry-on incubator. So that's what we have here in this iceberg diagram. Normally that top layer above the surface is that sort of traditional approach to startup incubators, and everything below the surface are those institutional, cultural and environmental conditions that contribute to a place flourishing. That's what normally doesn't get funded. So in this model from Dark Matter Labs for Nesta, we have this extraction of part of that private value uplift taking that value and sharing it back with everyone around that development who do contribute value. And so that's what Indy's explaining here. It's a sustainable mechanism for institutional civic infrastructure for innovation. So allowing us to fund those public activities, those civic institutions that are not often funded, to provide affordable housing space so that people can live in a place and work there while they're trying to get something off the ground, so that it can fund some of the creative and social uses that are necessary to help create this ecosystem of innovation as well. So that's, there's a lot in there. Look, I have just zoomed through 4 of the ideas that I explain in the book in a lot more detail, and there's a lot more in there that I'd love to talk to you all about, but I'm going to leave it there so we have more time for discussion.
Wow, okay, Jess, thank you so much. Really interesting. All right, let me start with the question. Let's talk about this word utopia.
Okay.
Wow, it looks like you have a helper.
I have a coffee now, which is what
Amazing.
I've been waiting. Thank you so much. That changes everything. Thank you. Sorry, utopia.
Yeah, so Jess, what does that word mean to you? And why is that the word, why is that the right word to use? And yeah, it's in the title of your book.
Yeah. You know, I think for me the idea of utopia, it's about aspiration. You know, I think it was described, oh gosh, who said this? But as the next island along from where you are, it will come to me. Who said that? But basically, it's something to aim for, and it's not something that I think, it's not a place that we will arrive at. It's not a perfect achievable state, but it is an aspiration. And I think we're living in this moment in history where all we see when we talk about the future are dystopias. We see visions that don't excite anything but fear. And when we only have visions of dystopia in our descriptions of the future, you don't give people a foothold or a sense of belonging or a sense of or a desire to be a part of that, and people are reacting out of a sense of fear, trying to put off some terrible situation rather than to participate in and bring into being something that's actually desirable. So for me, utopia is an aspiration and something that people can connect themselves to. But for me, a utopia is a place where people are able to inhabit and experience human flourishing. So to achieve their fullest, realize their fullest potential. And that's, you know, a concept from Aristotle of eudaimonia, this idea of living your fullest life, of living with purpose and meaning and value, feeling connected and recognized. Or there are many descriptions of a more holistic view of the, I suppose, living your human rights. So it's not just a bare minimum experience of being human, but this more enhanced experience of being human that is about connection, expression, and feeling a sense of purpose. And I think that, to me, that's what utopia is to me, everybody being able to experience that. But utopia itself as a concept is more of an aspiration.
In the early part of the book, you grapple with some of the 19th century utopians. Edward Bellamy, William Morris, writing in the late 1800s. And you are a bit critical of what they did, although clearly you're grappling with their attempt to think about a radically different world, and you end up suggesting that instead Ernst Bloch, the German Marxist theorist, with a distinction between abstract and concrete utopias is the more important key to thinking about it. What did you get from grappling with those thinkers of the past?
I think I was really looking for, you know, we live in this moment, and as I said, project forward to this negative vision of the future. Was there ever a time where people looked forward and projected to this positive vision of the future? And, you know, what I had in my mind was like the Jetsons, you know, and for me, Edward Bellamy is kind of like the Jetsons guy, who he imagined everyone living in this hyper technical, you know, the super smart city. Basically, we talk about smart cities today, and Bellamy was the sort of the smart city guy of the 1880s.
A vision for Boston.
That's it, a
right?
vision for Boston. Yeah. And he had this industrial army where everybody retired at 45, everyone was paid the same. You had this incredible logistics infrastructure where you received everything that you needed. People, you know, ate and lived communally, and it was quite inspiring in some senses, but there were a lot of gaps in it, and there was a lack of self-determination and creative expression. It was a very consumerist sort of approach. And then on the other extreme, you had William Morris, who is like the ultimate craftsman. You know, he is the British arts and crafts movement guru, one of the most iconic designers of all time. And he was really far in the other direction. He was like the tree changer, sea changer. I'm just going to, everybody, let's just focus on making beautiful things and live close to nature. But he didn't, and let's take money out of the equation altogether. And to me, that was really imperfect as well, like hopeful and something sort of inspiring about that too, about the sort of pastoral idol and the creative idol, but also quite alienating and also not quite right. And so what I took from both of them was that this idea of one utopia was unhelpful, an unhelpful way of trying to picture the future. And that's why I fell into Ernst Bloch, a philosopher who is really hard to read, but when you manage to get in there a little bit, you can see what he's getting at. And what he's saying is that we don't need perfection. What we need are moments of stimulation and moments that can pull you forward into imagining what is possible. And that really resonated with me. I wanted, you know, because I see that everywhere, but I don't think any one place or any one ideology has got it nailed. So that's why I ended up falling into Bloch.
Jess, how did you manage to write a book, given your other roles? What did your life look like that you were able to do this?
I was working on it for a very long time. I have been doing interviews for this for more than 2 years, maybe 2.5, 3 years. I have a very supportive partner who
brings you coffee.
Who brings me coffee, and who took a year off for paternity leave because I had a baby 11.5 months ago. And Pat's been incredible, and that's one of the only reasons that this book exists. And also I wrote a lot of it one-handed while breastfeeding because Ellie, so I did a lot of this.
Famous technique.
So I would just be feeding and then just like typing and editing. And Ellie didn't get much sleep. So I had all of these bonus hours for several months there. And then towards the end, I suppose the one silver lining of losing all of my contracts from March as a freelancer was that I had more time to finish the book and update the book.
All right, let's talk about community land trusts.
Yes.
Like many city planners, I love the concept of land trusts for all the reasons you suggested. For what it's worth, in America, there are two types of land trusts. There are conservation land trusts that try to protect open space. And there are affordable housing land trusts, sometimes called community land trusts. But there are also some other types of trusts that are not land trusts, but they have similar characteristics. There's only one affordable housing community land trust in America that's big, and it's in Burlington. And when Bernie Sanders was mayor of Burlington, he had a lot to do with that. That was part of the Burlington affordable housing strategy. There's no other CLT in America that got big. And the essential problem has been, how do you get control of the land? You have to buy it from somebody who's already had it appreciate. Mm-hmm. A lot of people kind of wish they could go back in time to the bad old days of the 1970s when there was urban abandonment, and go back and buy the land then when it was cheap, when they didn't realize they were going to need it 30 years in the future. And a couple of cities, especially New York, actually ended up with a lot of land when the 70s ended. Mm-hmm. And they put that into the Economic Development Corporation. They should have put it into a community land trust. Anyway, bringing that not great experience, translating that to Australia, this question of, if you believe in the model, how do you get the land into ownership by a trust?
Well,
any thoughts?
One of the first things, look, that's absolutely true. And there's some interesting work on this, particularly in Europe. And I think 2 points. So first of all is, you don't always have to get big. I think we need to look at models that are replicable, not just scalable. So like, how do you have lots of them rather than just big ones? And I think that's, this sort of decentralized approach is something we need to think about more across the board. But to do that, you have to iron out some of the bumps in the road and fill in the potholes so that it's easier to replicate, and every group that does it doesn't have to start from scratch. So that's why, if we can establish a legal model, for example, or find great financiers or patient capital that you can connect into this ecosystem to make it easier for people to do it in lots of different places, that would be a huge part of the solution. But the second thing I'd say in translating this locally is that it's not just private landowners, and it's not even that own land. We have a huge amount of government land in New South Wales and in Australia. And if you look at what London have done around the London model when it comes to housing development, they're on land that is owned by Transport for London, by Ministry of Defence, or by the National Health Service. There is a requirement that all development that takes place on those lands has 50% affordable housing. So there is a way that we could use land that is owned by Transport for New South Wales or New South Wales Health, or any of the other entities that own land on behalf of the public, to not sell the land to developers, or not sell the land even for those renewal projects that we see on social housing, like Waterloo, for example, is the one that is burning in my mind. Could we have community land trusts evolving alongside the redevelopment of social housing lands to keep that land in public hands and to give people input into that land, not just people today, but the future generations that we have obligations to? So government is one. And then the second one are organisations that are supposed to have an ethical foundation to their work, like churches. And churches in Australia are massive landowners, and there's a huge opportunity for us to work with, and you know what, they started getting that land a long time ago as well. So if there was a way we could have a model working with churches, tying into their beneficial purposes, I think there's a great opportunity there.
Henry VIII thought exactly the same way. It's a good insight. All right, I'm going to read a question. And it's a question about the politics of land value recapture, which is a really active discussion right now. Mm-hmm. Maybe a lot more active in government than the land trust discussion, because so many of the tax reviews that are being done say that the taxes should go up on land, down on down on other things.
Yeah.
However, the politics remain difficult. So let me read this question. I understand the concept of value capture, but homeowners or investors have already been slugged with stamp duty, land tax, development costs. We might as well add council rates too. And then capital gain tax when they sell, and all of this with after-tax money. What would be the offset if value increase were now not for the benefit of the homeowner, but for the broader community?
Look, it's a really good question. And I'm not talking about, individual homeowners. And I think that's something that we need to look more broadly at the institutional developers and investors and that approach. And if you look at, there are a lot of inefficiencies in our development system, and I can understand the enormous costs of property development. It is extraordinary. There are ways that you can mitigate, that we could work to reduce some of those costs. But I think part of the opposition that people encounter when they try and do large-scale development in communities is a sense of injustice from the community, that there's no direct benefit that's being felt by that community from that development. People have a perhaps unarticulated sense that public good and public value is being extracted from those developments, and all that they will receive in return is more competition for scarce resources like access to the local park or more traffic and congestion on local streets. So because of that sense of unfairness and value extraction, I think we see more complaints, and therefore we have a more expensive and slow and laborious process, and we have an anti-development mindset in many of our cities, because people don't see what they get from having this big building go next door in their downtown. So if we could readjust that relationship so that there was, and what I'm describing, particularly in that Dark Matter Labs proposal, is to I suppose levy a portion of the value uplift in a development, rather than saying, all right, you're going to put an extension on your house and we're going to put a fee on that, or we're asking all landowners to pay more. It's when a development potential is realised and there is value uplift that a portion of that is captured and recycled back into the local community in a more tangible and immediate and localised way. And it's not just like a Section 61 contribution. It's not just I'm paying for the footpath. It is, this money is going to fund affordable housing directly here, which is something the City of Sydney does do in the places we're able to, in Pyrmont, Ultimo and in Green Square. And hopefully one day soon we'll be able to apply that more broadly across the city. But also in funding other elements of the innovation ecosystem and the social ecosystem. So I'm not talking about every landowner, I'm talking about value uplift from major development. And I do think it needs to go, maybe we need to reframe the conversation about what value do local communities get from development, because I think that's contributing to the development fatigue that we're experiencing.
Yeah, okay, really interesting. And I suppose that's a little different to the committee, because we are talking about land tax on everybody, not just major development. So
I can't hate on that either, but I think what I'm talking about, and I'm primarily talking about inner city development. Like I think, and maybe transport oriented development. Places where you have extremely you have a dramatic increase in land value because of uplift, and how can that be managed in a way that's fairer for the whole community?
Let me read this question. I'd love to hear your thoughts about restarting a civic conversation. Is this imaginary narrative space not precisely the source from where we can create and discover our visions of utopia? Kind of a beautiful question.
Yeah, that's lovely. Look, that I'd have to tell you, and this is a spoiler for the end of the book, so sorry to anyone who's reading the book at the moment, but that was the hardest chapter. I kept thinking that I would I would find better examples of how people had created a civic discourse that was more meaningful and less oppositional. And I struggled just to find good examples of this. And it's something that I struggle with personally. And I think a lot of people who are either engaged in politics or who live their lives very online, like I do, that I struggle to not be oppositional. And I think our system is designed in a way that is very oppositional, and it's damaging, and it's hard for the people who are involved in it, and it doesn't lead to great outcomes. And I struggle with this all the time as well. So the best examples that I encountered in the world around this question were about bringing together people who had very different points of view, and giving them a safe forum to have personal conversations about them, so that there weren't group dynamics involved, but they were one-on-one conversations, and they were conversations that were about values and what drives people. And so it was about intrinsic values. That is a very labor intensive and individualized approach, but that it seems to get meaningful connections. And there was a great project in Europe called My Country Talks, which explored this. And then there are other places like the Difficult Conversations Lab in the US that also centers on this sort of approach. But I had a really interesting conversation on more broadly on that idea of how do we get different kinds of conversations and different kinds of outcomes with a guy called Case Dorst, who is an academic at UTS, and he does some really interesting projects all over the world. And Case talked about identifying people's social space. So the place between what they saw as the best outcome for themselves and what they saw as the altruistic version of what they saw as the best outcome for society, and finding a way to have a conversation with different communities about that gap between outcome for themselves and outcome for society, and what they were willing to sacrifice for that greater good, and understanding what people are willing to give up or change their position on in order to get that better social outcome. We don't have many conversations in our public life around values and common ground. And so if we can design better ways to do that, I think that would give us better policy outcomes as well, and probably a better public conversation.
The questioner just has a follow-up here, which I'll go ahead. David Snowden's Sinefin, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, framework, when understood as a sense-making framework, as a space for co-creating our shared understanding of complex reality, seems to be what you're describing. Not a reference I know, but maybe you do.
Oh, no, not at all. And I love this smart crowd because...
Yeah, all right, I'll get that to you.
We're all gonna learn a lot. That's awesome.
All right, let me ask another question. The commons.
Oh, yes.
I think a lot of people will associate that with the famous Garrett Hardin essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, or maybe Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for refuting Garrett Hardin, or maybe they'll associate it to the enclosure movement back in England. But for you, what does it mean, and what is important and useful to you about that idea?
Yeah, so much. I mean, for me, the commons is a third way. It's not public. It's not government. It's not business. It's society. And so many of the examples that I come across in the book, or that resonate with me, are society leading itself. Is this idea of people being empowered and active citizens with a broader public purpose in mind, not for their own personal advantage or for their own personal circumstances, but for a broader public benefit and for perpetuity, for future generations as well. So for me, the commons is it's what we do together. It's not just an asset or a resource. It's the stewardship of it. Commoning is the key thing here. It's an active mode of decision making. But I think we need to have a bigger discussion about what commons are, because commons are language is a commons, Wikipedia is a commons, you know, data and a lot of the internet domains that we work within are commons. They are resources that we steward together and that are improved by all of our input. But they go wrong when there are no rules and when we're not involved in actively making those rules and we don't feel empowered in making those rules. And I think a lot of our online lives and our digital lives have suffered because of a lack of rule making and public participation in that process. And so when I talk about the digital commons in the book, I'm looking at, you know, how can we as a society set rules so that we are in control of where our data goes and how it's used, but that we can also derive value from it and we can make decisions about where that value goes. So look, there's so much, there's a lot to be done on commoning, and I'm really glad that it's having a resurgence. And there's a group called the Sydney Commons Lab that are doing some work on this front, and they're doing a lot of work that's connected to community wealth building and local economies. So that's really interesting as well.
Yeah, interesting. Jess, you profile so many different kinds of projects, and I mean, one of the things that I think everybody who reads this book is going to love is it's all real.
Yeah.
These stories you tell are real stories, real things people are doing. But you framed your remarks today in terms of two great challenges for our time: income inequality and climate change. What are your thoughts on how you bridge from the scale of individual projects to the scale of the system?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what's sort of so daunting, is that the scale of all of these challenges. And I think that's also what's caused a big disconnect for a lot of people, and that we've told people that we have this global series of challenges, and the way that they can have input is by, you know, sorting their rubbish or, you know, making a donation to an NGO. And it feels disconnected and it feels insignificant. So for me, what I found as a way to make sense and to take action was to look at how we can have more localized impact on global issues. And so what I've been suggesting to people is to look at those issues that move you, and look at how, you know, where and how there are local resonances for those issues, and then invest your time and your energy in those local expressions of global issues, and to be an active citizen, an active participant in your local community, but for global impact. And I think that's the kind of key point, right? Because when I've talked about localism with other people, they've raised the real concern that we could be spiraling more towards tribalism and to localism as a form of exclusion. You know, my place, my street is all that matters, and whether you need to use it as a cycleway to get from there to there, or whether you need to, you know, build a block of units down the road to accommodate more affordable housing. I don't want that because that impacts my hyper-local community. You know, how can we be local actors with a global conscience is the big question. And, you know, people have been saying for decades, think global, act local. I know this, but how do we progress solutions that are decentralized and distributed solutions that are about replicability and connectivity rather than just scale? Because here's the thing, I think a lot of the solutions that we need are decentralized solutions that are about individual, localized and locally contextual responses, but they're connected up and they learn from different places. So it's like distributed energy networks. You know, we don't need the big green version of Origin Energy. We need 100,000 small local versions of Origin Energy in everybody's local community, right? We don't just need like one big community housing provider, as important as they are. We need dozens of different approaches to providing affordable housing and different trusts that might be networked and connected to provide affordable housing. So how do you learn from and connect with the world while also taking action in a way that's manageable and local? That's obviously always a challenge, but I think the other challenge is like narrowing down from the hundreds of thousands of different causes that you could pursue and adopt, and just picking a couple that really connect with you.
All right, Jess, we're almost out of time. Maybe I can just ask you to make closing comments to sum up.
Look, I think I'm so optimistic about Sydney. I think Sydney is a place where there's so much goodwill and potential. And I'm positive and optimistic about people's willingness to sacrifice or contribute or be part of change. I think the big challenge is, you know, how do we harness that energy and that goodwill and give people entry points into being a part of the solution? And how do we also, and where do we begin? And I would love, you know, ideas and outreach and comments from the Committee for Sydney community about great places to begin. Because, you know, I think if we can demonstrate the value of new approaches to land affordability, to commoning, you know, to so many of these things, if we can show them in real life, people have something that they can point to that's tangible, that shows the difference that policy choices can have in people's lived experience. And I think one of the challenges we have right now is that politics is this removed and abstract pursuit that doesn't have any kind of direct correlation to people's lived experience. And so it becomes an issue of like two teams fighting it out in a sport match. So if we can make policy more tangible and physical, and we can have great prototypes we can point to, then I think we have a better chance of showing people how their input works and how political choices can have tangible physical impact. I mean, obviously I can go on because I've gone on for about 420 pages in the book. So, but please get in touch if you have ideas or there's anything that you want to share with me. I'm very available.
And Jess, if people want to buy the book, where do they go?
Everywhere. It's everywhere. But please go to Kinokuniya or Abby's in the city. I've signed some copies there. Booktopia online. But I am truly thrilled. This thing is everywhere. It's in Big W, it's in Kmart, it's in Dimmicks, it's everywhere. So it's
incredible.
Hopefully near you.
All right. Everyone, thank you for joining today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live. Jess, this is the point where we'd be giving you a big round of applause, but thank you for taking time.
Thank you so much for making time, Gabriel, and thank you, everyone.
Okay. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye.